Hello there, and welcome back to the channel. I'm continuing the series of analyses of these artworks. This is a series in which I look at an artwork that's ubiquitous or famous in some way, shape, or form, and analyze it. And I try to do this organically, so that I don't come in with preconceived ideas other than the little that I know about the artwork. And doing so, I think, gives it a kind of seminar-style feel. And that by that I mean an ideal seminar in which things happen on the fly, and I'm not trying to convince you of anything because I'm discovering them as I speak it out loud. I don't know if this is compelling to anyone, but it's an exercise, I think, in learning for you and for me, and perhaps because we're learning together, because you are learning as I learn. There's something potent about that process. Today we're looking at Vincent van Gogh's painting The Starry Night. I don't know anything about this painting other than that it was painted in the late 19th century. A quick look at the Wikipedia page tells me to date this at 1889. I know that it was painted from his asylum. I think he was in an asylum at the time, and probably somewhere in the Netherlands. Where, I don't know. I don't think it particularly matters for the purposes of this exercise. And so here we go. And when I look at this painting, all of a sudden, I feel this sense of calm, right? There's a calmness in the fact that the sky looks like a series of waves, right? This is called the Starry Night, so we can tell based on that and on the landscape beneath it that we're looking at the sky, but I think we could very much well be looking at the ocean as well. So maybe we could think about that for a second. What might it look like for the sky to look like an ocean, to be similar in shape and form to the ocean? Certainly, we can say that the motions, the curves in the skies resemble waves. Well, knowing that this is from an asylum, that Van Gogh was working in an or was staying in an asylum when he created this piece. I think we have to begin with that fact of mental instability, a fact which I think can convince us, at least in part, that a kind of meshing together, mixing together of perspectives is evident in that sky. I mean, it's lovely, but at the same time, it's not quite how I think we would see the sky, right? So we know instantaneously that we're not getting something that's completely realist. I mean, this is not like a kind of Renaissance painting where there's extreme attention paid to making it look as lifelike as possible. This is more impressionistic, and when I say impressionistic, I'm not attempting to pull through some kind of formal art definitional term of the word. I simply mean that what Van Gogh could have done is looked at the sky and then gone back to his bed and painted, right? His impressions, his internal image reproduced on the canvas. Okay, now how does that affect us differently than the realist image, right? I think with Mona Lisa, while we're not getting something that could be mistaken as a picture, we're getting something that much more approximates the way that humans naturally see things than we have here, right? One way in which we know that is that the stars look absolutely nothing like stars look like in our night skies, right? They look like little islands in this oceanic imagery. They're little balls of fire, almost perfect concentric circles coming out of them. So the stars, if usually quite small in our perception here, become big. Okay. Again, once again, I'm going to invoke the mental instability to point at a kind of registering of that mental instability through the depiction of star size, right? When you aren't looking at the world in the quote-unquote right way, what you're getting instead is a completely skewed sense of size. To be honest, though, I feel like I'm leaning a little bit too much on the mental instability thing. So I'm going to try to. I mean, like it's obvious, right, that every artist brings a different perspective to something, and I don't want the big idea of this painting to be simply that Van Gogh saw the world differently than we do, ergo the sky looks differently than we might see it. Okay, so let's think instead about why he might depict the stars as circles, right? Well, Um, I mean, what do these balls look like, right? They look like, let's say they look like eyes, right? They look like eyes, and I think you can see that, right? Because there's a tiny little, the star in the middle is kind of like an iris, right? And the rest of their circle, the space around them could be something like the vitreous humor of the eye. And so, what does it mean to see the eyes in the sky, right? The eyes in the sky. If when we look at a painting, it's usually us envisioning the work of art. What we have here is something quite different, right? We have, in a sense, the art looking at us. Now, there's something, right? Because this is no uncommon occurrence for a painting. In fact, if we look at the last painting we just analyzed, the Mona Lisa, arguably Mona Lisa's looking at us, right? Mona Lisa's looking out of the picture, out of the canvas, onto the observer. But here it's occurring in a much more subtle way, right? Here I'm suggesting it's occurring. It's occurring because the stars look like eyes, right? And so, and so, if the act of looking at a painting and reading a painting, analyzing a painting is a profoundly visual act, it's not simply a one-way street, right? Now, Van Gogh isn't putting that explicitly like maybe Da Vinci would have. I mean, I didn't even go into this when I looked at the Mona Lisa painting, right? But here it's almost conjectural what I'm doing. Perhaps you think I'm overreading it, but I am kind of convinced that these things are made to resemble eyes. In fact, I think if you look at the moon in the top right corner, you really see something that resembles an eye there, right? And the eyes are perhaps looking at us, making a scene, right? So, so what happens when we read a work of art, right? You might say, well, we understand it more. When we look at something, when we read something, we come into cognizance of more of its nature. But, but if the eyes are instead directed towards us, the suggestion is that if we are learning about the painting, it is also learning about us. Or perhaps we enter the painting with our vision, and then the vision eventually reflects back on ourselves. Now, again, this is not obvious, right? I think that's the important thing about Starry Night. Okay, these are the stars looking like eyes. It's not something that's on the surface. It's something that you have to think about for a little bit. I mean, it's something that I didn't realize until I started looking at this painting right now. You know, and you know, you might even say that the waves sort of are all kind of forming in that shape. They all kind of look like eyes. Okay, I'm very taken by this idea, as you can tell. But I think it's worth noting that the stars and the moon are not quite the same, right? The moon is the moon is distinguished by being larger, as it often is in our sky, right? Um, but it's also not given the prime position in the work's title, right? The night is determined by the stars and not by the moon. And perhaps we can play a little bit with depth, nearness, and distance when it comes to paintings, right? And when it comes to perspective. I just said now that when you read something, one of the things you're doing is trying to find meaning in it. And perhaps that meaning is really a realization about yourself, reflected through the painting. But that the meaning requires your work. So the moon close to us is perhaps the most obvious and largest thing in our vision. But the stars further away also offer their own gifts. And Van Gogh, by titling the piece The Starry Night, makes the stars the center of his artwork. That which is further away is that which is more important for Van Gogh, that which determines this night. Okay, so we're just looking at the stars and the moon, and the stars, again, are the thing that inheres meaning, even though they're the thing that's further away. So when we look into onto a work of art, that which is on the surface is not that which we should immediately look at. Okay. Now, we haven't even paid a little bit of attention to the rest of the picture. On the left side of the painting, we have this enormous figure, right? And it's kind of difficult to determine what it is. I believe it's a tree, you know, and I don't know where I got that piece of knowledge, but I believe it's a tree. Okay, but it doesn't really look like a tree, you know? it looks like it could be anything. It could be a mass of tentacles. It looks like seaweed, right? Which I think plays with the imagery of the waves in the blue sky, right? It looks like seaweed, but I think it also is. It looks like fire, right? It's got the shape of fire, and perhaps then it contrasts with the night sky, which is figured as an ocean. So why combine those two things? I mean, if this tree is both fiery and seaweed, which I am gonna, like I absolutely think it's supposed to look like seaweed. Why take this tree and put it both in agreement, in complement with the sky, and against it, right? To be clear, the tree is both seaweed and fire, right? One of these things jibes well with the sky, and the other is eliminated by it, right? Well, another thing I realize now is that stars are pretty much just balls of fire, right? And so if we see this sky as a figurative ocean, then it's got tons of fire in it. There's a bringing together of contrasts here, right? So if the sky itself holds those contrasts by having both the balls of fire and the resemblance to an ocean, so too is a kind of contradiction inherent in the tree, which is at once seaweed and fire. Okay, now you might think I'm ridiculous for seeing that much into the tree, but let's also see what the tree is doing, right? It's cropping up in front of our vision of the stars, right? And I think that like many works, okay, so almost every painting since the Renaissance uses the idea of perspective. That's something that's very distinctive about they tell you that it's very distinctive about Renaissance paintings compared to medieval paintings, a better use of perspective, especially in the West. I don't know that much about, say, Islamic art, Chinese art, other forms of art, but at least for us, perspective, for us in the West, perspective is one of the key inventions of modernity, right? And what is perspective? Perspective is the realization that some things are closer to us than other things. Some things are further away from us. And yet, again, I have to say, Van Gogh centers the thing furthest away from us in this picture, right? The stars. That is what determines the night, right? That which is closest to us. It's not called the tree night, not the moon night, the village at night. It's called the starry night, right? So why emphasize those things that are furthest away from us? Well, I think we could draw a nice little picture here about the search for knowledge, how the search for knowledge begins with things on the surface, those are the things that are most apparent to us, and as we get older, perhaps we look further and further away. Okay, now that's one depiction of the search for knowledge. First, you look at what is most obvious, and then you dig deeper and deeper and deeper. In other words, you look at meanings which are further and further and further from the obvious thing until you arrive there. So to return us, I think, to this tree, right? This tree which is right in front of us. Okay, why a tree? Well, trees have all sorts of associations in the West. Perhaps the most notable one is the association of the tree with the tree found in the book of Genesis in the Garden of Eden. That is, of course, the tree that caused the fall of mankind, traditionally in the Christian religion. And so, putting this tree, which obstructs our view of the heavens, harkens back, I think, that moment in which Adam and Eve's taking of the fruits from the tree obscured our relationship with God. That's one reading of it, right? Well, we could see it another way too. Things which are evident to us, real to us, graspable by us, such as the tree, can often obscure our experience of the things far away from us, things that have no immediate relationship to our vicinity. So again, it's a matter of perspective, which is again an admission that there are things which are further away from us and things that are close to us. But what a painting does, and of course painting is at its heart a visual medium, what painting does is, well, it forces us to unite different perspectives. the stars and the tree appear in the same frame. And in fact, by making these stars larger circles, Van Gogh is demanding that we see them with greater size and shape, that we might regularly assign to these points in that in the star system, right? Um, he's saying, look at the tree, but also do not forget the stars, right? Look deeper, and everything's so beautiful. I think it's correct to just kind of marvel at the beauty of this piece. Okay, and then of course, compositionally, we've looked at almost everything besides the village, right? And that takes up about a fourth of this painting, the bottom right quadrant. So what do we see in the village? Okay, well, there's one very prominent thing. That's the church spire, right? The church spire models the tree in its shape, but kind of notably, it's much smaller than the tree, right? It's much small. In fact, every house in this village is tiny. It looks tiny, and they're definitely discernible, right? But these houses, I think, are shrunken, and I think that's actually kind of important, because the stars, given the fact that they're larger than just little dots on the night sky, they are actually larger than the houses. So if the stars are expanded from their usual size, the moon is expanded from its usual size with these concentric circles coming out of these heavenly bodies, and the tree, of course, rises up prominent so that it dominates our perspective. Against all that, the village buildings are made small. So the village buildings are made small, and again, I think we're meant to point, like when we look at the village, our eyes sort of gear towards that spire, the church, right? The church is the thing that's probably the central node amidst all these very small things, right? Okay, now you might see the kind of direction that I'm going with this, right? Like I was just talking about Renaissance humanism and how the creation of perspective allowed the Renaissance to depict depth to their paintings, right? And I think one thing that allows for is the relative scaling of things. Of course, things that are larger are generally afforded more importance. So what does Van Gogh do here by making the tree, the stars, and the moon all larger than the buildings, most notably the spire, right? Well, I think he could be commenting on the lesser position of religion by the late 19th century compared to earlier eras, but that's kind of a, I think that may be a little bit too easy, right? I want us to look at the stars, look deeper than that, right? Well, let's think, because I honestly have no idea where I'm going with this, right? Well, the stars are bright, and there's light in the houses as well. So I suppose you could say that there's a resonance between the light of the stars and the lights inside the windows of the houses, right? I'd say that the one building we see without any lights is again that church spire. Actually, I think that's kind of deeply notable, right? If every single house, I mean, like, there's a practical reason for this, right? Like, if a church is usually used in the daytime, it would not really have lights at nighttime, but if people are living in the village during the night, they would be using their lights. But Van Gogh doesn't have to depict it that way. He could depict the Starry Night later in the evening when everyone's asleep, but instead he chooses to give us a picture of a village that has various houses with lights on, alongside stars which are bright, but the spire, the church, is dark. So the church has gone dark. And so, yes, religion has less prominence by the late 19th century, right? And what is afforded its replacement? Well, I mean, the classic thing is science, right? But I think because we're looking at stars in this case, one could say that the science in particular that's being referenced is astronomy, right? But astronomy is meant to stand in, I think, for science and for reason overall, right? The late 19th century, this is a time distinctly after the Industrial Revolution. We're on the cusp, if not deep in the thick of the rise of modernism, right? So everything is kind of changing. Van Gogh is one of those pioneers, right? And I think he's showing the houses with light in them, light that is the identical color as the stars, in order to show us that where knowledge was distributed when it left the church was into those very quotidian dwellings, right? Um, Perhaps this is a rather hopeful painting that the light of the stars, the light of science, is not exclusively brought to a single institution, the church, but is rather democratically spread out throughout the entire village, right? So I don't think there's an accident here that the stars are the same color as the light in the windows, right? Um, the stars lighten up the sky, but so do the windows and their lights, presumably artificial lights of some sort. Maybe they're candles, but it's the starlight color, which is important. Um, yeah, they are also lighting up the sky in their own way. These villagers, um, and and yeah, I mean that shows something. Okay, so I'm gonna try to tie this all together before we finish, right? I guess in the first half of this, I was talking about knowledge and the search for knowledge, and how sometimes you have to. I mean, I think how this painting is a representation of looking deeply into things, a promotion of like critical thinking, right? That you don't want to just look at the surface. You want to look at the stars, dream, and read those stars, read meaning into those stars. And in the second half of this, I kind of commented on the village and how small it is, and how, in particular, the spire, the church, is de-centered. I mean, church is sort of the traditional center of small villages across Christendom, and instead that center has been replaced by a more democratic distribution that mimics the distribution of the stars. So the search for knowledge, and this kind of resignation of the centrality of the church in the Netherlands. These things are not unrelated, of course. You know, what does it mean to search for knowledge in a world in which there is no more dominant spiritual and thus intellectual authority? Well, it might mean that people need guides to acquiring knowledge, right? It might mean that now we have this freedom to think and to know and to search for knowledge, but at the same time we need guides on how to do that, right? And I think this is, you know, a thing that I note more generally in culture, right? It would be better if people think deeper about things, right? Do not accept the surface reading, the most obvious meaning of a work of art, but look deeper into it, right? Okay, so that's what I'm saying in The Starry Night. Perhaps it's nothing at all like what you see. I would love to hear what you think in the comments. And I haven't even commented on so many other things in this work. But this is my first stab at a kind of organic reading of The Starry Night. If you have listened this far, I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this. I've loved doing this, and I thank you. Until next time.